So let's cover evolution and the origin of the species. And one thing when people hear origin of the species is they immediately think about Charles Darwin or maybe Alfred Wallace or any of a series of individuals who over the course of time looked inside their backyard and maybe they dug underneath a rock or something like that and they found that it looked like there were other organisms that were on the planet long before we were or maybe just about the same time we were. And they're no longer present. And it begot the question, how and when did we arise? And then what were the forces that actually caused things to actually change? And that's a really important idea if you think about the fact that we pretty much live on a blob of water, right? This is water. Let's put in a couple of land masses in here maybe. Woohoo. Call it the land mass, call that a land mass. Another landmass, yay, over here, right? Remember, these land masses, of course, have been changing their locations over time as this structure spins around. We're also spinning around that sun-like thing someplace else. Where's that yellow? Let's imagine here, that sun-like thing, and it's 93 million miles away. Yay, so energy's coming in this direction. So what's actually happened in the 500 million years or so that this has been spinning around? 14 billion years ago was when the explosion occurs, right? And then we cool down, so about 500 million years ago, life as we know it can begin to occur, where we take those 4 macromolecules, we begin to orient them in such a way we can put them inside a single-celled structure, and then you see organisms come and go over what we're going to consider to be time spans. But I'm not here to argue where life came from or who begot life or any of that. I want you to think about what are the forces that are actually allowing for life to occur. And going all the way back to chapter 1, we think about those eukaryotic structures, those prokaryotic structures, noticing that in eukaryotic structures we can get multicellular, dynamic, terrestrial and aquatic organisms. Prokaryotic cells on the whole, they tend to be single-celled structures. They probably vastly outnumber us in terms of genetic diversity and all of that. And then there's this piece inside our story that many people forget. And that is, of course, let's put E for eukaryotic here, put P for prokaryotic. And then if these are interacting with one another, they're driving their sort of responses not only between one another, but they're also driving their responses to what's happening here on this planet, depending upon where you are. Terrestrial experience, subterranean experience, aquatic experience, maybe deep sea thermal vent experience. And inside all of this, if we're considering this to be alive, and we're considering this to be alive because it has those canonical characteristics, where it has those 5 characteristics of living organisms, we also want to never forget about our friends, viruses, and how it is viruses are constantly interacting and then also changing how it is that, one, each of these organisms will change, thinking about maybe what might be happening as a result of, say, a viral infection, or how is it they protect themselves from a viral infection, driving yet again another adaptation that may or may not cause a mutation, and that mutation may or may not drive the success of what that organism will be for reproduction. And that ultimately is what we want to be thinking about here. As we think about what the origin of a species is, it's also the continuation of a species, because without the ability to continue the species, the genetic information isn't passed on from generation to generation. So think about this. You're in a country, let's say England, let's think about this. You're going to be on a ship for, I don't know, 5 years or so. And you're looking for suggestions as to what might actually happen across the entirety of species. And of course, what Charles does when you have 5 years at your side, I guess would be the way I'd put it, would be that you have, what are the characteristics of heritable suggestions that can be passed from parents to offspring to allow them to survive? More offspring are produced than can survive, and their competition for resources suggests that whatever tools they have, they better employ as quickly as they can. Otherwise, they then themselves turn into something else's characteristics of maybe ingestion for an energy source. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that characteristics are going to vary, and these variations are oftentimes heritable, and those variations may or may not lead to that success we were talking about a moment ago. So ultimately, this comes up with this idea that the ability to generate variation is what we'll eventually end up calling adaptation. And the classical examination of how this worked were the finches from the archipelago in the Galapagos, where depending upon where you were inside of a tree or any environment, the shape of the finch's beak would change. And when you consider the fact that one possibility is that all birds arose from, say, dinosaurs, what you're actually looking at here, of course, is that these are all once upon a time some form of reptilian-like structure that would have to run around and then also acquire food sources to keep itself alive. When this ultimately is what happened, you became airborne. You still had these structures that could allow you to use something that's more dense than the target you're trying to kill and ingest, and then turn those materials into those 4 basic macromolecules for these organisms to then go off and find a mate. Now, there are 2 different people inside the story, and there's no bad that comes out of it. Darwin goes off and makes these observations, sits around, mulls them over. Meanwhile, he's a very active scientist, sort of gentleman scientist in the country, been doing many, many different things. Quite a fascinating sort of character. And on the other side, you have Alfred Wallace, who also a very fascinating character. They're both very adventurous in the sense of what they're willing to undertake to make observations. Wallace would end up almost dying inside the Amazon forest, trying to prove what he thought was where, not necessarily the cradle of life came from, but where biological diversity actually came from. And they decided at the end, I think, people try to try to say that Darwin got scared that Wallace came along and they were going to usurp each other's power or something like that. But the reality, as best I can tell, is Wallace let Darwin knew what he was doing, and Darwin gave Wallace feedback. And even though I'm sure there was some professional sort of tension there, maybe nobody was looking to win a Nobel Prize or anything like that. They just wanted to share what they had discovered. And the more interesting part to the story, of course, is who they were presenting their information in front of. The Linnaeus, or Linnean society, of course, was the father of all categorization as we know it in Western civilization, where we're thinking about how it is we give the names to different organisms based on their phenotype and who they most closely resemble. So what is the evidence for actual evolution? Is there divergent evolution or convergent evolution? I'd say it's divergent at this point in time as a result of increasing complexity inside the genome. Fossil records in some cases support this. In some cases, it looks like there's pretty much a status quo until something disrupts the environment, things are pretty much in a stable configuration. To further support this, are there homologous structures? Are there vestigial structures, meaning who begot which structures you're looking at now? And when you're looking into biogeography, what do you actually see? And what does it actually mean when the land masses change and you create divisions in what were once whole populations? And if you think about, say, what an earthquake does or a volcano does, these all create long-lasting physical changes in an environment that were not there presently before they occurred. Ultimately, though, what we end up doing, of course, especially if you're thinking about where science is going now, we're using molecular biology to describe what's happening at the genetic level. So if each of these things were, how do we see the outside of the living organism and what is its reproductive success, we can now look at literally the genetics of those organisms, and then how does the genetics of those organisms actually ensure that they're successful or ensure that they're going to fail. So let's think about what natural versus artificial selection is. Artificial selection occurs as well inside of any single environment If you think about prearranged marriages and things like that, artificial selection, especially if they have offspring. But notably in Darwin's Origin of the Species, he first draws the attention of artificial selection and animal husbandry before going into depth into natural selection. Remember, one of the things that I first tried to teach you when we were talking about Mendel is long before we were thinking about peas. We were thinking about which goats gave the best coat or the best milk, or which sheep gave the best coats of wool to make the best coats out of, sort of thing, right? So we as an organism, like every other organism out there, and some of them are fairly terrifying in their ability to actually do this, can artificially select the success of not only their offspring, but the environment that they live in as well. We think about homologous structures. You can look at a college level biology class that's out there. I'm not even sure if they run so much anymore, as comparative anatomy and comparative physiology, where you go from human, say from human to dog to bird to whale, and you see, generally speaking, what are the similar homologous structures. They're not identical. They don't necessarily perform in exactly the same way, but in the rules of the physics of the world in which these organisms exist, these structures are still required. And that's the important part here. It's a part that's often overlooked in all of these discussions. For any of these organisms to exist in the world, the laws of physics must be maintained or respected. And this is how Mother Nature responds. Here's a humerus across each of these. When we're actually looking at, this is the radius and that's the ulna. This would be the radius and the ulna of a whale fin. Okay, and even though this looks more like a human hand down here, these are the phalanges down here, metatarsals, carpals. What you actually see, of course, is that this increased surface area allows for the organism to propel itself through the ocean, whereas this allows us to create a prehensile grabbing tool we call a hand.